Fellow at Black Hat Asia 2023. And with me today, I'm very pleased and very privileged to have Dagmawi Mulugeta with Netskope, all the way from the United Kingdom, and of course you spend a lot of time in the United States as well. Yep. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me, Jane. I'm very happy to be here. I love the energy at Black Hat Asia. It's been great so far. Definitely an experience that I would like to have again.
Oh, wonderful. So hopefully we'll see you next year again, talking about a different topic.
Absolutely, absolutely.
But for today, you talked about insider threats, packing corporate data with them as they leave, right? And it's very interesting, you know, the turnout at your talk is quite a full room, isn't it? And you got lots of interesting questions. So it's great to get you here to talk about some highlights of your presentation. So to start off, insiders, how do you define insiders? Because obviously it's a term that has many different variations and definitions for many different people. Some people say suppliers are insiders, right? Or families of employees are insiders as well. So in your scope of your work, how do you define insiders?
So that's a fantastic question, Jane. Insider, as it's typically defined, like you said, is any entity that impacts risk or brings risk to an organization from externally, right? Or sorry, from internally as opposed to externally, where you have, you know, things like malware, et cetera. Insiders come from within inside, like employees that you've given access to. The way we've scoped it in our research is even smaller than that, where we said a malicious insider is an individual that takes data with them via a cloud application. So that's how we've defined an insider threat.
Now, insider threat obviously has been a big topic in the cybersecurity community for many, many years, right? And many people recognize that that's probably one of the top, if not the top risk. So, but what motivates you and your colleague to focus on this area of research?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when we've interacted with a lot of organizations, this thing keeps coming up where they are concerned about flight risk employees, individuals that are getting ready to leave their employment. Okay. But these employees need to have access to data to do their day-to-day jobs. So organizations are concerned about these particular types of users, these flight risks, taking data with them when they leave their employment. So once these these topics, these points keep coming up and up and up, we started digging down the rabbit hole to see, okay, how can we find these in a reasonable way without having to spend hundreds of man hours sifting through alerts. So that's what initiated the motivation. That's the motivation for this research.
So how do you kick off your project then? So you were looking at across 200 organizations, I believe, and across 4 million users. Yeah. And you found 58,000, I believe, who are leavers and who potentially pose some form of insider threat.
Yeah. So that's another great question. So the way we looked at it is we looked at anonymized users data collected by the Netskope Cloud Security platform relating to a subset of customers with their prior authorization, and we looked at these users' behavior. And when we saw a dip in activity for over 4-week period, so an active user that was active suddenly has a dip in activity, and we don't see that user again, we say this individual has left their employment. And we found 58,000 of these users across close to a 9-month period, and that's how we kicked off the investigation or the research.
Right, so 58,000 potential, or leavers, right? And what were your findings? What percentage of them were taking corporate data with them?
Yeah, so when we looked at these users, we saw 15% of them use personal apps to move data, but 2%, these 2% mishandle corporate data before they left. So they were taking data that was violating corporate policy, so blatantly violating the policy the organization had in place before they left their employment, right? And we saw that a lot of this data movement actually happens 50 days, or starts to happen 50 days before they left, much earlier than the typical 2-week or 4-week notice that's given by individuals before they leave. In fact, we saw in our research that 50% of the data that they move that violates corporate policy happens before the 14-day period.
Right, okay, so before the notice period, obviously they know that they were going to leave, so they had a lot plan going on there. So the corporate data that we're talking about here are intellectual property, corporate policies, possibly, audit reports,
corporate strategy, customer information, So
all this sensitive corporate data, basically. Okay.
Yeah. So when we define sensitive data here, we're talking about data that the organization would not want to leave their corporate perimeter. Would not want it to go into bad people's hands, competitors' hands. They just would like it to stay in their corporate perimeter. And the kind of beauty of this research is we're not defining that. We're taking organizations' definitions of what is important to them into consideration here. So if an organization said intellectual property or PII is sensitive to me, that's how we're labeling the traffic we're looking at to identify this the sensitive corporate data exfiltration.
So you talked about 15%. So 15% were moving data into their cloud applications.
Yeah.
And then 2% were violating the corporate policies.
Yeah.
So the 15%, they are not in any violations of policies or...
So the 2% are part of the 15%.
Oh, right, I see.
Yes.
Okay,
yeah,
okay.
so the 15% are people that use cloud applications to move data before they leave. So the reason we brought this up is some of the users we've seen, that 2%, are actually just negligent people that didn't know that they were moving corporate data. It's very hard from our research to tell user intent, obviously.
Of course.
So we introduced this 15% to show that a larger cohort of users move data to their personal applications before they leave as well. And we saw this particular trends we were looking at, we saw that 60% of the files they move were spreadsheets, images, and portable documents, right? And 82% of this data is moved to Google Drive and Gmail, right? So this is the type of trends we see when individuals get ready to leave in this 15% that move data to personal cloud applications.
Right, so potentially the points for Google Drive to take note of to identify some of these potential malicious movements.
Yeah, and it's Google Drive, the thing is, it's so accessible, right? It makes it so easy for people to collaborate, et cetera, that some of these people take that as a way to just move data before they left. It just makes it that simple, right? So we see that these users, these 2% of people that take data with them, prefer Google Drive, Gmail, and OneDrive to move data.
But interesting, isn't it?
Yeah,
not Dropbox or any other sort of shared collaboration tools.
Yeah, and to be completely honest, we still haven't yet to realize what the reason for that is. Why the Google Drive and Gmail? When I said it's accessible, that was purely from the incidents we've reviewed with customers, with organizations, right? But we still don't know the underlying reason. For organizations that have outright blocked Google Drive because these are the insights we've seen, we actually, these organizations come back to us, and more often than not, they say, hey, this is impacting productivity. We can't collaborate with other organizations. We need to go back and fix this. Yeah.
And of course, you brought up this point as well. Censoring the access to Google Drive is an easy solution, but obviously it's not. It's impacting productivity, and therefore there has to be another way of mitigating this risk. And you talk about 3 aspects of
exactly.
Right.
Yeah. So the way we recommend approaching this is by looking at 3 key signals. The first is volume, so identifying whether the data that's being moved is anomalous for that user and that organization. The second is the nature of the data, so applying data labeling. Things like DLP policies come into play here to identify whether the data is being moved is sensitive. And then the last one is direction. You need to be aware of whether this cloud application is one managed by the corporation, by the organization, or is it outside of the corporation's management. And this is where instance awareness comes in, or we talked about looking at the domain that's being used to log in, right? Is it Gmail, Yahoo, iCloud? In which case it's personal and not corporate managed. You want to identify these. So these three key signals are very important.
So So based on your conversations with organizations before you kicked off this project, before your colleague and yourself kicked off this project, what are some of the standard sort of procedures that they have in place to monitor insider threats such as this? Yeah,
so in some cases, what we've seen is the organizations weren't really aware that this was happening, right? So they were... They knew that insider threats were a problem, but they didn't have these signals in place to address them, right? So what we do is typically we ask, we've actually looked at a large variety of signals. We found these 3 to be the key ones that indicate this sort of activity. So we work with these organizations to configure these 3 detections in their environments so that they have full insight into this behavior. And we've actually found, working with these organizations, we found real-world insiders trying to do this behavior in real time, and we've identified it with these customers, with these organizations, and prevented what could be more catastrophic situations.
Is it more? Is the problem more sort of sensitive for larger organizations than, say, smaller organizations, where it's possibly easier to track, the traffic, network traffic?
Well, that's a good question. So when you say smaller organizations, you have to make a note of that. They also have smaller teams to review these alerts that are coming in. So these larger organizations might have a larger set of alerts to review, but they also have a larger group of people to review them. Now, the problem is still there in smaller organizations, but obviously for larger ones, like you're hinting at, it is a problem because you have such a large amount of activity to review to see if it's malicious or benign. What we found in our research actually is when you look at these 3 signals, the volume, nature, and direction of data, you can reduce that alert the alert size that you have to reduce by close to 43x. That means for every 50 alerts that you have to review without these signals present, you can reduce that to 1 or 2 more concerning ones by using these 3 signals to filter out things that aren't anomalous, that are going to the corporate instance, or that don't violate corporate data or corporate data policies that are in place. Right, so these 3 signals help reduce the effort you have to put in, whether you're a large or small organization.
So again, these 3 signals are volume, direction, and
nature.
Nature, right?
Yeah.
So whether it's a corporate data or personal data. So obviously that would be dependent on how the corporate or the organization itself labels such data, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So your work also touch on really focusing on the movement to cloud, but not so much, as you also pointed out in your presentation, insider threat relating to levers taking information using USBs or photocopying policies, right?
Yeah. So we scoped our research into insiders that take data with them via cloud applications. We weren't focused on, USB drives, people that use temp drives to take data with them, or people that print data sensitive data and just walk out of the building, or people taking pictures of their monitors. Now, it's not to say that these aren't valid insiders. There's concern here as well, and we're researching into these to find additional insights. But for the sake of the presentation we gave, just to make it digestible to the to the audience and to a wider audience, we had to scope it to just using cloud applications.
So based on your conversations again with your clients across various organizations, do you get the sense that insider threats where it's not related to exfiltrating data onto the cloud is a smaller problem or dimension compared to using USB drive or photocopying?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So when we've organizations that are concerned with insider threats, and if they're concerned about 2 particular type of threats, let's say insiders that use USB drives or insiders that take data via cloud applications, what we've seen is a decent amount of organizations might feel comfortable blocking out USB drives or removable media altogether.
That's right.
So it doesn't work for all organizations, but we've seen a decent cohort want to do that. But you can't do the same thing with cloud applications, like we said, because if you block Google Drive, that's going to impact productivity, and you don't want to leave productivity on the table. So you have to be looking at the signals that we presented, nature, volume, and direction, to be able to allow your user base to be productive, but also be aware of where your data is going, and then identifying these insider threats earlier on, right? So that's why we focused it on cloud apps as well, because this is a much more important space to have signals to detect this sort of behavior.
So what is your takeaway for organization listening to this interview and also to your presentation? Should they be going away and looking at how they monitor traffic and make sure that they have those 3 sort of signals coded into the way that they are detecting anomalies? Yeah,
so that's a great point. So the 3 key takeaways from our presentation, I'll reiterate them here, were 2% of people that left their employment, and we saw this across 200 organizations, take data with them that's violating corporate policy before they left. 75% of this data movement, right, majority of this data movement happens 50 days before they leave, so much earlier than the typical notice period is given. But if you monitor the nature, volume, and the direction of the data movement, you're able to find these users, these 2% performing this activity. And we've used these signals. These are field-tested signals that we've used to identify real insiders that would have caused damage to organizations. So this is a recommendation that, it's from a doctor that's using their own medicine per se, so we highly recommend using these signals.
So one last question. Thank you so much for your insight, but one last question.
Sure.
So many people will say, oh, right, it's only 2%. What do I have to worry about?
Yes, that's a great point. And that's actually, the data might seem that way, but that's not how you want to be thinking about this, because while this 2% isn't 98%, 70% of the data they target is intellectual property and PII, right? And you want to be proactive in this sort of analysis, because this might end up being causing some worst case scenarios. It might end up being existential for your organization, causing massive lawsuits. So putting that effort in earlier will help you in the long run.
No, I do agree with you. Some of these are what we call in some statistics studies tail risks, right? We tend to sort of prioritize them less than the central distribution, right? Yeah. But it's something that we need to be aware of, because extreme risk can cause black swan events, for example.
Exactly, at the tail. Exactly, yep.
Right, so thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's my pleasure to be on this talk, Jane.
Thank you.
Yep.